got out of prison, I didn't expect to hear from anyone again. And when I did hear, it was Mick Steele. The bloke was absolutely brilliant. I mean, everything he did. I mean, like an engineer. He was a brilliant engineer. I mean, I couldn't understand really why he broke the law. And when I first agreed to smuggle, I didn't give it a second thought whatsoever. I just did it.
I was trying my hand at running a business, repairing and selling fridges and freezers. Mick called me up and asked me how much it would be to replace the fridge in Sarah's new house, because the one she had wasn't working. Depending on how much it was, he was going to buy it for her. But he told me not to tell Jackie that he was paying for it, or she wouldn't like it, if she thought she was spending their money on someone else. I told him it was best if I went and had a look, because I might be able to get it working. Jackie Street picked me up in her RAV4, and we met Mick, and then went over to Sarah's place. It didn't take too long to work out what the problem was. The fridge had been plugged into the cooker socket, so every time Sarah turned off the cooker, she turned off the fridge as well. It was around lunchtime, and a couple of friends of Sarah's turned up to cheer her up with some bottles of wine. So we all sat about in the living room, chatting about Pat. The whole conversation revolved around how bad he was, how out of control he'd become, how much he'd changed. It turned out that when Pat found out her friend's boyfriend was helping Sarah to move out, he went completely mad. Even though he'd actually told her to leave, he somehow blamed this bloke for splitting the two of them up. Along with Tucker and Rolf, they went to track the bloke down. They basically kidnapped him off the streets and took him back to Pat's house, where they held a knife to his throat and told him to snort 6 lines of coke. He tried to say no, but they made it pretty obvious that if he didn't do as they say, they would hurt him really badly. So he started snorting, and they made him snort some more and more until basically the guy passed out. Once he was unconscious, they stripped all of his clothes off and started podding cigarettes out all over his body until he came round. Then they made him snort some more coke until he passed out, and then burned him until he came round again. After a while, Tucker and Rolf were getting bored. They said they thought the bloke had had enough. But Tate wasn't having it. He was like a man possessed. He kept waking the bloke up and making him snort more and more until they eventually ran out of drugs. Then Tate took the bloke in the boot of his car and dumped him in the front of the garden of his house. When the bloke's girlfriend came home, she found him rolling around naked in the living room, covered in burns and gasping for air. He had so much powder up his nostrils that he couldn't breathe through them. He had no idea what was going on or who he was. He was in a total state, just crying constantly. They had really broken him. He ended up in a psychiatric unit for 3 days. When he got out, surprise, surprise, he decided not to press charges. Sarah was upset by the whole thing, but I was surprised to see that Mick was almost in tears himself. He kept saying that he couldn't believe how someone he had once considered such a good friend had changed so much. He'd get more and more angry every time Sarah mentioned something new that Pat had done to her. He seemed to be taking it really personally. Eventually, he walked over to Sarah and gave her a big hug. It was a whole new side of him. I just got in from cleaning the car when the phone rang. It was Mick being all weird and casual. He said he was having a few friends around for a drink that afternoon at Angler's Green, and why didn't I pop over? Oh, and could I bring my fishing gear with me, because he wanted to borrow it. So I gathered up my waders, a change of clothing, and my passport, and said goodbye to my wife. I knew we were on for another run. I drove over in my Sirocco, parked in the driveway, and then walked up the path. Mick met me at the door and ushered me into the living room, where I saw Jack Worms and Peter Corey already sitting down chatting. The other thing that caught my eye was this enormous pile of money on the coffee table, a pile so big that, depending on where you sat, you couldn't actually see some of the other people around the table, but no one mentioned it. The others nodded hello, and Mick told me to get myself a drink. Walked over to the fridge, got myself some beer, and came and sat with the others, so the pile was blocking out Corey. Then we all started talking about this and that until the conversation died down, and suddenly Mick grabbed a pile of money off the table and started flicking through it. And then Jack and Peter started doing the same. Then Mick said to me, "Don't just sit there like a prat, Darren. Grab some money and start counting." It turned out it wasn't such a big pile after all. It was several small piles all gathered together. There was supposed to be £76,000 from Pat Tate and friends, £28,000 for some friend of Mick's from down south, £14,000 from Jack Worms, and Mick had put in a little bit himself to make up a total of £124,000. But nothing was taken on trust. We each had to count each person's money, then hand it on to someone else for check-in. I don't think anyone was particularly surprised when Pat's bundle turned out to be £200 short. Mick wrote a note to himself so he'd remember to subtract the difference from the amount of drugs he gave to Pat. Then we bundled all the cash into a bag so that Corey and I could get on our way. Although Corey hadn't put any money into the deal, Mick once again insisted on giving me the big speech about how, if there were any decisions to be made, Corey should make them, because he was the experienced one. Then, just like before, he gave me, rather than Corey, the radio. "What do you reckon the weather will be like for crossing this time, Mick?" I asked. He shrugged. "Alright, I suppose. Certainly not as bad as the last time we came over." That wasn't what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that it was going to be the worst crossing ever, that Corey was going to hate every minute of it. "Well," I said, "I'll keep my fingers crossed for the two of you." The plan this time was that Corey and I would take the ferry over as a couple of foot passengers, then hire a car once we got to Amsterdam. Although there's no real border between Amsterdam and Belgium, Mick was always concerned that a British car driving between the two was far more likely to be stopped than a local one. As far as he was concerned, we'd been lucky up until then, but now he didn't want to take any more chances, especially as he'd gone over the magic £100,000 mark for the first time. On the way to Harwich, in the light of what Mick had said, I made the decision to make a real effort to get on with Corey, but somehow he managed to start pissing me off almost straight away. When we got to the docks, he refused to buy the tickets because he didn't want to get seen by the cameras, and then he refused to carry the money through customs and insisted on walking through on his own 10 minutes after I'd gone through, just to be sure he could say he wasn't with me if it all came on top. I suppose the thing that really got to me was the way he spent so much of the time bragging about what a big man he was, and how so many people were scared of him. The truth was, he was a spineless twat with no bottle, and I was lumbered with him. We got a cabin on the boat, and I left Corey there to look after the money, while I went off and had a few drinks in the bar, then went to the casino. I lost a fair bit of money, but I didn't care. I stayed there for the rest of the trip, just so I could avoid Corey. The next morning, Paranoid Peter was living up to his name in full. He made sure that I carried the money through Dutch customs when we got off the ferry, and he stayed a little way behind me. And then he insisted that I book the train tickets in my name, and when the ticket inspector came along, he made sure it was me who had the money, just in case. But when we got within spitting distance of Stone's Calf, he had a sudden change of heart. "Give me the bag," he said. "Huh? What for? Look, don't muck about. You know I'm in charge here. Just give me the bag." I didn't have the energy to argue. I thought, fuck it. If he wants to look like the big man, as if he's the one in charge of the money the whole time, let him. This time, Harris was waiting for us along with one of his Dutch partners when we got to the calf. I'd seen this other guy hanging around before. He was the one who led me out of the city the first time we brought the drugs from there, but this was the first time he'd actually been there whilst we were striking the deal. He didn't say anything the whole time. He just sat in the background, making me nervous. We wanted grass, but Harris checked with his partner, then said there wasn't any around. That seemed fair enough. After all, the first time we'd gone over, he didn't have anything at all, so we settled for resin. We fixed the price, and I checked the exchange rate on Teletext. It worked out that we were getting the stuff for around 1,125 per kilo, roughly half what it would be worth once we got back to Britain. It was pretty much then that the problems began. Corey started getting the money out, emptying his gear including his dry suit onto the floor, and Harris just looked over and said, "Oh, what's this?" So as quick as a flash I said it was a flying suit for the helicopter. Corey looked at me as if I was totally mad, like I'd lost the plot. "Don't be soft," he said. "It's my waterproof for the boat." He then looked at Harris and raised his eyes to the ceiling like I was some sort of moron. I was still trying to think on my feet, trying to save the day. "Yeah," I said, "but they only use the boat if they're having a problem with the helicopter. But it's fine today. I'm no expert in the drug business. But one thing I do know is that you don't trust anybody and you don't tell anyone any more than they need to know. It's just too big a risk. And telling your supplier just how you're going to get the stuff out of the country is pretty fucking high up the list of things not to do." But that's just what Corey had done. We got to Blankenberg with a few minutes to spare, so I brought some bags from the supermarket across the harbour, and Corey and I started transferring the drugs over. In our rush to leave Amsterdam, I hadn't realised just how badly packed the drugs were. Even the individual blocks hadn't been wrapped up properly. The whole lot had just been thrown together. There was no way any of it was going to be waterproof. Then Corey and I realised we'd run out of bags, and the shop we'd bought them from had shut for the evening. We ended up having to leave one load in the box. Not the best place to store something for a 70-mile trip across the sea, but we just didn't have any choice. By the time we finished, it was almost the rendezvous time, and Corey started taking charge again. He insisted on doing things by the book, parking about 2 miles away, and walking down to the beach to check the coast was clear, walking back to the car, and then bringing it a little closer. I just looked at him and shook my head. I'd already spent 24 hours too long in his company, and it was really starting to get to me. Whether he was in charge or not, I wasn't going to behave like a prat, unless it was absolutely necessary. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" I said to him. "Secret squirrel. Look, we're parking here, and that's it. If the coast isn't clear, we'll see it from the car, and we can drive away. If you don't like it, you can just fuck right off." That pissed him off something rotten. So after we put our waterproofs on, started taking the bags down to the beach, he stormed off in a huff, and in the wrong direction. I pointed out that he was at the first concrete pipe, and that the meeting place was at the second one. He looked at me with daggers in his eyes. Basically, he was so pissed off with me, he didn't want to agree about anything. If I'd have told him his name was Peter, he'd have wanted to have a row about it. "No, it ain't. It's always the first one." I shook my head. "No, it isn't. The reason it isn't, moron, is because if it was the first one, you'd be too close to the fucking pier. Darren, I think you're forgetting who's in charge." So I left it. By now, Mick was 5 minutes late, and Corey was in quarter panic mode. We were sitting in a sand dune on this little mound of grass, surrounded by bags of puff, looking out over the water, listening to the radio for Mick to come in. But he didn't, and there was nothing we could do apart from wait, and wait. 15 minutes later, and Corey was in half panic mode. I was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable myself. There were all these people taking their dogs out for walks on the beach, passing within just a few yards of us each time. And as they passed us, their dogs were going absolutely fucking mad for the drugs. I mean, these dogs were going crazy for the stuff, tearing at their leashes and barking like crazy. And all we could do was just sit there on our waterproofs with these dodgy looking bags and pretend we didn't know what was going on, and wait, and wait. Mick was now 25 minutes late, and Corey had missed out on the interim stage and gone into full panic mode. He grabbed one of the bags, the lightest one, surprise, surprise, and ran down to the water, desperately scanning the sea for any sign of Mick. Just then, the radio crackled to life. "Sparky, come in, Sparky." "Yeah, I'm here." "Okay," said Mick. "Flash a torch." I did, and he told me that he couldn't see it. I flashed it again, and he still couldn't see it. "Where the fuck are you?" "I'm at the beach," he yelled. "I'm actually on the fucking sand. Where are you?" I grabbed the other bags and dragged them down the beach, but still couldn't see Mick, let alone hear the boat. Corey was literally running around in circles and generally being useless, so I flashed the torch again. "I see you," said Mick. "You're in the wrong fucking place. You're fucking miles away. What are you doing there?" Mick had, quite rightly, parked at the second concrete pipe, so Corey and I had to drag all the drugs about a quarter of a mile to where he was. There was no point in explaining. I knew that whatever I said, Corey had a good 4 hours to convince him that it was my fault, so I just pushed the boat out to sea and waved them goodbye, and good riddance. I thought I'd had more than enough excitement for one night, but unfortunately, it wasn't quite over yet. I'd parked the Toledo right next to this karate club, and when they saw some bloke in waders struggling to get into a car, my hands were freezing from the water, and I couldn't work the lock properly. They thought I was a car thief. The next thing I know, there was 25 massive blokes in judo suits running towards me, shouting out in French. I didn't have a clue what they were saying, but decided I wasn't going to hang around to find out. I got in the car and watched them grow small in the rearview mirror. What a night. I drove back to Amsterdam and got totally lost trying to find the car hire place, so in the end I flagged down a cab and got him to drive me there so I could follow him. After that I got the cab to drive me to the Delta Hotel. It was too late to get a ferry back to England, and I fancied a few beers anyway, so I spent the night in Stone's Caff talking bollocks and drinking myself into a stupor. By the time I got back to the hotel, I was shattered. I slept like a baby. It might have been a nightmare, but at least nothing else could go wrong. But how wrong I was.